The screech of a straining jet engine filled the air, a tortured metal scream that echoed across the flight line. Inside the control tower, every eye was fixed on the single, wobbling blip on the radar screen. A voice, calm but tight with strain, crackled over the speaker. "Tower, Widowmaker. Coming in hot. One engine, hydraulic failure." The air traffic controller's knuckles were white as he gripped his microphone. "Copy, Widowmaker. We see you. Emergency crews are standing by." A long, static-filled silence followed, broken only by the controller's whispered addition. "Godspeed, Siren." Then the scene dissolved. Rewinding 48 hours, the sun had not yet risen over the airbase. A cool, pre-dawn stillness blanketed the tarmac, broken only by the hum of distant generators. Inside a sterile, brightly lit gym, Captain Eva Rostova was a study in controlled fury. She wasn't just exercising. She was waging a war against the heavy bag, her fists and feet connecting with a series of sharp, percussive thuds. Each strike was precise, powerful, and born of a deep, simmering frustration. Sweat plastered her dark hair to her forehead, and the muscles in her arms corded with the effort. She was alone, as she almost always was. The door swung open, letting in a blast of cooler air. Master Sergeant Miller, a man whose face was a roadmap of 30 years spent on flight lines, stood there holding 2 steaming mugs. He didn't speak. He just watched her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Ava finished her combination, her breathing heavy but even. She turned, acknowledging him with a slight nod. "Sergeant, Captain," he said, his voice a low rumble. He held out one of the mugs. "Black, 2 sugars. Just how you like it." Eva took the mug, her calloused fingers brushing against his. "You're up early, Chief." "So are you," Miller replied, taking a sip from his own mug. His eyes, sharp and miss-nothing, scanned the empty gym. "Couldn't sleep?" "Something like that," Eva said, avoiding his gaze. She looked past him, through the doorway, to where the dark, hulking shapes of A-10 Thunderbolts were just becoming visible in the creeping light. Those planes were her sanctuary, the only place where the world made sense anymore. The silence between them was comfortable, built on a foundation of mutual respect. Miller had been her crew chief since her first assignment to the 104th. He knew her aircraft better than she did, and he knew her almost as well. He'd seen the brilliant pilot she was before the incident, and he'd seen the shadow she'd become after. The official report had cleared her of wrongdoing, but the court of military opinion, presided over by Colonel Riggs, had delivered a guilty verdict. "Briefing for the Codor Valley CSR is at 0700, Miller said. His tone neutral, Eva's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'm aware. They're sending the new kids. Davis and his backseater." Eva just nodded, taking a long swallow of the hot, sweet coffee. It was a bitter pill wrapped in a warm drink. The Codor Valley mission was complex, dangerous, the kind of operation that demanded experience, her experience. But Colonel Riggs had made his position clear. Captain Rostova was a hangar queen, a plane kept on the ground for display only. She was to fly training simulations and nothing else. Her call sign, Siren, felt like a cruel joke now, a warning no one needed to heed. She finished her coffee and placed the empty mug on a bench. "Time to face the music, Chief." Miller gave a grim smile. "Just remember, Captain, you can ground the pilot, but you can't ground the instinct." He watched her walk away, a solitary figure moving toward the main building. He shook his head slowly, a mixture of pride and concern in his eyes. He knew that fire in her hadn't been extinguished. It was just banked, waiting for a spark. And in their line of work, sparks were never in short supply. The dawn was breaking, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, a beautiful backdrop for the storm he felt brewing. The briefing room was cold and smelled of stale coffee and antiseptic cleaner. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a harsh, shadowless light on the faces of the assembled aircrew. Captain Eva Rostova took a seat in the back row, a deliberate choice that placed her on the periphery. She kept her posture straight, her gaze fixed on the large tactical map displayed at the front of the room. The map was a mess of red circles and threatening symbols clustered tightly around a jagged area labeled Codor Valley. Colonel Riggs stood before them, a pointer stick tapping impatiently against his palm. He was a man carved from granite, his hair a close-cropped silver, his eyes the color of a winter sky. He began without preamble, his voice cutting through the low murmur of conversation. At 0400 this morning, a Special Forces team was compromised during an intelligence-gathering mission deep inside the Kodor Valley. The pointer smacked against the map, right in the center of the densest cluster of red. Their exfil bird was shot down. They are now evading on foot, and their position is rapidly becoming untenable. A young pilot in the front row, Captain Davis, leaned forward, his expression a mixture of eagerness and nerves. He was the one who had been given the mission. Ava watched the back of his head, noting the tense set of his shoulders. He was good, but he was green. Their last transmission confirmed heavy enemy patrols converging on their location. Riggs continued, his pointer circling the valley. Satellite imagery from 20 minutes ago shows increased activity at these 3 suspected SAM sites. The intel weenies are calling it an integrated air defense network. I'm calling it a goddamn fortress. It's a miracle the team is still breathing. He turned from the map, his eyes scanning the room, seeming to deliberately skip over Eva. The CSR package will consist of 2 Jolly Green helicopters for extraction, with Davis and his wingman providing close air support in their A-10s. Your primary objective is to suppress enemy fire and create a window for the helicopters to get in and out. This is not a fight you want to prolong. You hit hard, you hit fast, and you get the hell out. He looked directly at Davis. Is that clear, Captain? Crystal, sir, Davis said, his voice a little too loud. Riggs gave a curt nod. Good. The helicopters launch in 90 minutes. Your birds should be prepped and ready. The meeting was effectively over. Chairs scraped back as the selected crew members stood, a buzz of focused energy filling the room. Ava remained seated, a silent observer. As Davis passed her row, he paused, offering a hesitant, almost pitying smile. We'll get them out, Eva. She gave him a single, slow nod. I know you will, Captain. Good luck. The room emptied quickly, leaving only Eva and Colonel Riggs. He gathered his papers, not looking at her. The silence was heavy, charged with unspoken history. Ava finally stood, the movement causing him to glance up. Rostova, he said, his tone flat and final. Colonel, she replied. Stopping a few feet from him, he finished stacking his folders and finally met her gaze. There was no warmth there, only a cold, professional assessment. I trust the situation is clear. You are to remain on standby status. Your aircraft is not to be moved without my direct authorization. He stepped closer, his voice dropping, not out of confidentiality, but out of pure, undiluted intent. That valley is a meat grinder. The rules of engagement are tight for a reason. What happened in the past? We can't afford a repeat, not here. Not with these stakes. Ava's face was a mask, betraying nothing. She had learned to build walls around her emotions, brick by painful brick. Riggs looked her up and down, a dismissive flick of his eyes. The pilots we're sending in today, they understand the chain of command. They understand discretion. If I were to send someone with a reputation for independent action, well, frankly, Rostova, that's an asset we might not get back. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Some pilots, if they went down there, we'd never see them again. And I won't risk a multi-million-dollar aircraft and a second rescue mission on a lost cause. Understood? It was more than an order. It was a verdict. It was a statement of her perceived worth. Ava felt the words like a physical blow, but she didn't flinch. She simply held his gaze, her own eyes dark and unreadable. Perfectly, sir, she said, her voice dangerously quiet. He gave one last, curt nod and walked out, leaving her alone in the silent, brightly lit room. The tactical map still glowed on the screen, a detailed portrait of a nightmare unfolding in real time. 8 lives were trapped in that valley of death, and the man in charge had just told her she was more disposable than they were. The walls she had built felt thinner now, and behind them, a familiar cold fire began to stir. The ready room was a tomb of tense silence. The mission clock on the wall ticked down with a relentless, mocking rhythm. Ava sat stiffly in a chair, her eyes fixed on the live drone feed displayed across multiple monitors. The green-hued, ghostly images showed a bird's-eye view of the Kodor Valley. a jagged, unforgiving landscape of steep ridges and dark shadows. She watched the two jolly green helicopters, tiny specks on the screen, skim the treetops as they made their approach. The radio chatter was crisp and professional, but an undercurrent of strain was palpable. Jolly Green One. "You are 5 minutes from the LZ," the voice of the Airborne Warning and Control System Aircraft, or AWACS, intoned. "Be advised, we are seeing intermittent radar emissions from the valley floor. Possible mobile SAM. Copy AWACS, we see it." Proceeding with caution, Eva's hands clenched into fists on her knees. She knew that terrain. She had studied it for months, even after Riggs had benched her. She knew where a mobile launcher could hide, where the choke points were. She saw the path the helicopters were taking, and a cold knot tightened in her stomach. It was all wrong. They were flying straight into a perfect ambush point. Then all hell broke loose. The drone feed erupted in flashes of light from the ground. The radio exploded with frantic voices. "Taking fire! Heavy anti-aircraft fire! SAM launch! SAM launch! Brake left! Brake left!" Ava was on her feet, her body rigid. On the screen, one of the helicopters banked violently, flares bursting from its sides in a desperate attempt to decoy the heat-seeking missile. The other helicopter peeled away, its rotors chewing the air. "Jolly Green 2 is hit. We've lost hydraulics. We are aborting! Repeat, we are aborting the mission!" The voice of the ground team commander, call sign Nomad, cut through the chaos, sharp with desperation, but terrifyingly calm. "Wax Nomad Actual. Confirm the exfil package is aborting. Our position is compromised. Enemy forces are converging. Estimate we have 30 minutes. Maybe less." There was a pause, a crackle of static that sounded like a held breath. "Request immediate alternative extraction. Situation is critical." The AWACS controller's voice was strained. "Nomad Actual, we copy. Stand by. We are assessing our options." Another voice, younger, laced with panic, broke in from the ground team. "They're everywhere! We need air support now!" Ava's heart hammered against her ribs. The options were being assessed, but she knew what the assessment would say. The mission was a failure. The risk was now too high. Colonel Riggs's words echoed in her mind. Some pilots. We'd never see them again. He was already writing off the 8 men on the ground. Her eyes darted to the mission clock. 28 minutes. That was all they had. She looked out the window of the ready room across the sun-baked tarmac. There, parked in a row, were the A-10s. Her eyes found one in particular. Tail number 780684. Widowmaker. Sergeant Miller and his crew were performing routine checks, unaware of the drama unfolding in the skies over the Kodor Valley. The voice of the young soldier on the ground came back, a whisper of sheer terror. "Please, don't leave us here." That whisper was a detonation. It shattered the last of her restraint. The cold fire that had been smoldering within her erupted into an inferno. She wasn't just a pilot who had made a mistake. She was a soldier, and soldiers did not leave their own behind. She moved without another thought. She wasn't running toward a plane. She was running toward a promise. She burst out of the ready room door, the bright sunlight hitting her like a physical force. Her boots pounded on the hot asphalt as she sprinted across the flight line. Sergeant Miller looked up from his clipboard, his expression shifting from curiosity to alarm as he saw her coming. Eva didn't break stride. "Sergeant! Pre-flight Widowmaker, now!" she yelled, her voice raw with an urgency he had never heard before. Miller's eyes widened. "Captain? There's no time! They're dying out there! Load her with everything she can carry! Mavericks, rockets, full cannon load!" "Now, Chief." Miller didn't hesitate. He saw the absolute conviction in her eyes, the same look she had before a mission when she was at her best. He turned to his crew, his voice booming across the tarmac. "You heard the captain! Battle prep! Move, move, move!" The ground crew exploded into action, a well-oiled machine snapping into a higher gear. Fuel hoses were disconnected, weapon safeties were removed. Ava scrambled up the ladder into the cockpit, her hands moving on instinct, flipping master switches, bringing the avionics to life. The low whine of the APU starting up was a sweet, familiar sound. This was where she belonged. As she pulled on her helmet, Colonel Riggs's furious voice screeched over the squadron frequency. "Rostova, stand down! That is a direct order! Shut down your aircraft immediately! You are not authorized for launch! Ava's hand hovered over the radio controls. She could hear the rage, the absolute certainty of his authority. She looked down at Miller, who was looking up at her, his face a question. She gave him a single, determined nod. Then, with a decisive flick of her wrist, she switched off the command channel. The cockpit fell silent, save for the building whine of the engines. The only voice she would listen to now was the one calling from a valley far away. She pushed the throttles forward, and Widowmaker began to roll. The A-10 Thunderbolt, a machine built for one brutal purpose, felt like an extension of her own will. The twin turbofan engines roared to life, a deafening crescendo that vibrated through the airframe and into Eva's bones. She felt the familiar, powerful push against her back as the jet began its roll, taxiing toward the runway without a word to the tower. The silence in her headset was profound, a void where Colonel Riggs's orders had been. She had severed the chain of command with a flick of a switch, and the weight of that act was a physical pressure in her chest. Ahead, the runway stretched out, a long ribbon of concrete shimmering in the heat. In the periphery of her vision, she saw a base vehicle, its lights flashing, speeding toward the taxiway in a desperate attempt to cut her off. It was a futile gesture. She was already committed. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, her eyes scanning the cockpit instruments, fuel flow, engine temperature, hydraulic pressure. Everything was green. Sergeant Miller and his crew had done their job perfectly. She lined up on the center line, the nose of the massive plane pointing toward the empty sky. For a fleeting second, she thought of the consequences. Court-martial, dishonorable discharge, prison, the end of everything she had ever worked for. Then the voice of the young soldier, "Please, don't leave us here," echoed in her mind, drowning out all other thoughts. She pushed the throttles to their stops. The acceleration was immense, pressing her deep into the ejection seat. The roar of the engines became the only sound in the universe. The airspeed indicator needle began to climb, sluggishly at first, then with increasing purpose. The end of the runway rushed toward her. At the last possible moment, she pulled back gently on the stick. The nose wheel lifted, and then the main gear left the ground with a final, comforting thump. She was airborne. Climbing away from the base, she felt a strange, surreal calm descend upon her. The decision was made. The die was cast. Now there was only the mission. She switched her radio to the mission frequency, and the chaos of the Kodor Valley flooded her cockpit. "Nomad Actual, we have enemy infantry within visual. 200 meters and closing!" "Wax, any word on that, air support?" "We are running out of time and ammo!" Ava keyed her microphone, her voice steady and clear, a stark contrast to the panic on the ground. "Nomad Actual, this is Widowmaker. I am inbound to your position. ETA 20 minutes. Mark your location with smoke and keep your heads down." There was a stunned silence on the radio, followed by a surge of relieved, almost disbelieving chatter. "Widowmaker? Copy that. God, are we glad to hear your voice." "Whoever you are, you're an angel," another voice cut in. The AWACS controller, call sign Watchtower, broke in, his tone cautious. "Widowmaker, this is Watchtower. We do not show you on any authorized flight plan. Please confirm your mission status." Ava took a deep breath. "Watchtower, my status is simple. I am the only air support Nomad is going to get. I need a full threat update for the Kodor Valley. Prioritize mobile SAMs and anti-aircraft artillery." She could almost hear the debate happening on the AWACS plane. She was an unauthorized rogue asset, but she was also the only thing standing between 8 soldiers and a brutal end. After a long pause, Watchtower's voice returned. "All business now." "Copy, Widowmaker. We are painting multiple threats, uploading data to your system now. Be advised, the primary threat is a mobile SA-19 system last located in grid Bravo 39er. It is active and hunting. The data streamed onto her multifunction displays. The valley was a hornet's nest, but now at least she could see the hornets. She dropped lower, skimming the landscape, using the terrain to mask her approach. The world outside her canopy became a blur of brown and green. She was no longer Captain Eva Rostova, the disciplined officer. She was Siren, a call sign earned for the way she could lure enemies into a fatal mistake. And she was flying straight into the heart of their territory, The calm inside her was not the absence of fear, but the focus that comes when there is only one path forward. Every minute, every second brought her closer to the fight and closer to the men who were praying for the sound of her guns. The ridgeline was her salvation and her potential tomb. Eva kept the A-10 so low that the smell of pine and damp earth seemed to seep through the canopy. The terrain-following radar beeped a constant, gentle warning, a reminder that a moment's lapse in concentration would mean a fiery end against the mountainside. The data from AWACS painted a terrifying picture on her screen, a symphony of blinking red icons. But up here, in the dirt, she was invisible. "Widowmaker, you are 3 minutes from the LZ." Watchtower's voice was tight. "The SA-19 is still active. We are detecting its search radar. It knows something is coming." "Copy," Eva replied, her voice a low whisper. Her eyes scanned the instruments, then the world outside. The valley was opening up ahead. She could already see the dark, ugly smudges of smoke rising from the location where the helicopter had been hit. Then, the first sign of contact. Tracers. Lazy, orange arcs of light floating up from the tree line. They weren't aimed at her yet. They were aimed inward toward the spot where Nomad and his team were pinned down. The sound of the firefight reached her a second later, a distant, popcorn-like cracking. It was real. They were still alive. Nomad actual Widowmaker. "I have visual on the tracer fire. I am commencing my run." Pop smoke. A moment later, a thin plume of green smoke rose from a small clearing nestled against a rocky outcrop. Around it, the earth was alive with the flashes of muzzle fire. Eva pulled back on the stick, climbing slightly to gain a better attack angle. The moment she cleared the ridge, the cockpit erupted in a deafening screech. The missile lock alarm. "The SA-19 had her! Sam launch! Sam launch!" Watchtower yelled. Eva's body reacted before her mind could process the threat. She shoved the stick forward, diving back toward the valley floor, while simultaneously dumping a cloud of chaff and flares. The world outside spun violently. She caught a glimpse of a smoke trail streaking past her wingtip, close enough to feel the heat. The missile shot past, detonating harmlessly against the ridge she had just left. No time to think. She leveled the aircraft, her heart hammering against her ribs. The gun sight was dancing over the enemy positions. They were dug in around the clearing, concentrating their fire on the green smoke. "Widowmaker is in hot," she said, her voice miraculously steady. She thumbed the weapon selector to the 30mm cannon. The familiar whirring sound of the Gatling gun spinning up was a visceral promise of destruction. She took a final, shallow breath, her finger resting lightly on the trigger. Then she squeezed. The sound was not a gunshot. It was the ripping apart of the sky. Bert! A 5-second burst. The aircraft shuddered with the raw power of the weapon. From her perspective, it was a straight line of pure energy lancing into the tree line. From the ground, it was the hand of God smiting the earth. Trees disintegrated. Dirt and debris erupted in a geyser. The enemy muzzle flashes near the impact zone winked out instantly. She pulled up hard, the G-forces pressing her down into her seat. The alarm screamed again, another missile lock. She rolled the aircraft, a hard, gut-wrenching turn that made the wings groan in protest. More flares bloomed behind her like fiery flowers. "Widowmaker, that was a hell of a shot." Nomad's voice crackled, filled with a fierce, desperate joy. "You got 'em running, but they're still on our west flank. Copy, Nomad, switching to rockets. Keep your heads down." Eva brought the A-10 around for another pass. This time she selected her Hydra rockets. She lined up on the west flank, where she could see figures moving through the trees. She let loose a volley. The rockets streaked away with a whooshing sigh, then impacted in a series of concussive thumps that shook her aircraft even from a distance. The forest on the west side of the clearing became an inferno of shrapnel and fire. She had broken the first wave, but as she climbed away, she saw more vehicles speeding down a dirt track toward the engagement. The fight was far from over, and the SA-19 was still out there, its radar patiently searching the skies for the slow-flying plane that had dared to challenge its dominion. The brief silence after the rocket impacts was more terrifying than the noise of battle. Eva had carved a bloody circle of safety around the downed team, but it was a temporary reprieve. On her tactical display, new threats emerged like angry red blisters. 2 technical trucks mounted with heavy machine guns were speeding down a valley road. More concerning, the SA-19 search radar had found her again, its electronic fingers brushing against her aircraft. Widowmaker, Watchtower. Be advised, the SA-19 is active and painting you. Vector is 0900. You are his primary target. Copy, Watchtower, Eva replied, her mouth dry. She was a lumbering beast in a sky full of hunters. Her only advantage was the terrain. She pushed the stick forward, descending back into the valley's shadows, using the jagged landscape as a shield. She had to take out those trucks before they reached the clearing. She lined up for a strafing run, the trucks bouncing in her gun sight. But as her finger touched the trigger, the missile lock alarm screamed with a new, piercing urgency. This wasn't a search radar. It was a lock. The SA-19 had a solid track. Breaking left, she yelled into the void, throwing the A-10 into a violent, corkscrewing turn. She dumped flares, a brilliant constellation of false targets blooming behind her. She waited for the impact, for the searing pain of shrapnel. It never came. Instead, a different sound tore through the cockpit, a brutal, wrenching crunch that felt like a giant had punched the side of her plane. The aircraft shuddered violently, yawing to the right. A storm of warning lights lit up her panel. Master caution. Hydraulic failure. Engine fire right. She hadn't been hit by the missile. In her desperate evasion, flying nap of the earth, she had flown directly over the technical trucks. A lucky, or brilliantly aimed, burst from a heavy ZSU anti-aircraft gun had found its mark. The right engine temperature gauge was spiking into the red. The stick felt heavy and unresponsive in her hand. Thick black smoke streamed past her canopy. The acrid smell of burning metal and hydraulic fluid filled her nostrils. Mayday! Mayday! Widowmaker is hit! I've lost hydraulics on the right side! Engine fire! The response from Watchtower was immediate, the voice tight with controlled panic. Widowmaker, confirm your status. Can you maintain control? Eva's world had narrowed to the gauges in front of her. The A-10 was built for this. It had redundant systems for a reason. With a grimace of pain, she reached for the manual reversion lever. It was stiff, requiring immense physical strength to engage. She grunted, pulling with all her might, muscles straining against the G-forces and the damaged aircraft's desire to tumble from the sky. The plane bucked again. But the controls responded, now moving through a system of cables and pulleys. It was like trying to steer a battleship with a wrench. Every movement was a battle. Manual reversion engaged, she gasped, fighting to keep the wings level. I have partial control. Shutting down right engine and activating fire suppression. She executed the emergency procedures, her training taking over where instinct failed. The fire warning light extinguished. The violent shuddering lessened. But the plane was critically wounded. It handled like a brick, losing altitude fast. Widowmaker, can you make it back? It was Nomad's voice, the hope in it already fading, replaced by a grim acceptance. They had seen her get hit. They saw the smoke. They knew what it meant. Eva looked at her navigation display. The home base was a distant dream. She didn't have the altitude or the control to make it. But she wasn't done yet. She looked down at the clearing, at the 8 men depending on her. Negative, Nomad, she said, her voice raspy with effort. I'm not going home. But I'm not leaving you. This bird still has some fight left in her. She pointed the wounded nose of the A-10 toward the approaching technical trucks. She might not make it back to base, but she could make one last, final pass. She could buy them time. It was all she had left to give. The world had become a narrow slit of focus, a tunnel of pain and determination. Every breath was a sharp ache in her side, a reminder of the shrapnel that had torn through the cockpit. The A-10, her mighty Widowmaker, was a dying beast. It wallowed in the air, sluggish and heavy, the remaining engines screaming in protest as it fought to keep them aloft. The smell of smoke and scorched metal was a permanent fixture now, a funeral shroud settling over the cockpit. Widowmaker, your altitude is critical. Watchtower's voice was a distant, static-laced echo. You are below safe minimums. Eva didn't reply. Her attention was locked on the 2 technical trucks speeding toward the clearing. They were close, so close she could see the gunners swiveling their weapons, preparing to unleash hell on the trapped soldiers. Nomad and his team had no cover left. This was the end for them unless she intervened. She ignored the screaming alarms, the shuddering airframe, the terrifying loss of altitude. She had one gun left, the GAU-8. With a grimace, she switched her last remaining hydraulic boost to the cannon controls. It was a desperate gamble, robbing what little control she had from the flight surfaces to give the massive weapon one last chance to speak. "Nomad," she transmitted, her voice a raw scrape. "This is it. After this pass, find a deep hole." There was no response, just the sound of ragged breathing over the open channel. They understood. The targeting pipper danced wildly over the lead truck. The plane was shaking so violently she could barely keep it in her sights. She was coming in too low, too slow. Trees whipped past her wings, branches clawing at the torn metal. She was skimming the deck, a ghost riding a thunderbolt into hell. She squeezed the trigger. The sound was shorter this time, a brutal 2-second "Bert!" that shook the aircraft to its core. The cannon fire walked across the road, a line of erupting earth and shattered metal. The lead truck vanished in a ball of fire. The second truck swerved violently, its gunner thrown from the mount. But the effort was catastrophic. The strain was too much. A final sickening crunch echoed through the airframe as something vital gave way. A new alarm joined the chorus, a deafening, continuous bell. Control failure. The stick went dead in her hand. The A-10 was no longer an aircraft. It was a 50,000-pound piece of falling metal. It yawed hard to the right, the nose dropping toward the unforgiving ground. Eva's training kicked in one last time. Eject, eject, eject. Her hands flew to the ejection handle between her legs. She pulled. The world exploded into a violent, shocking silence, followed immediately by a sledgehammer blow to her entire body. The canopy blew away. The rocket under her seat ignited, shooting her up and away from the dying Widowmaker. The G-forces crushed her, stealing her vision, her breath, her consciousness. She tumbled through the air, a puppet with cut strings. Below her, the A-10 plowed into a densely wooded hillside with a ground-shaking roar. A fireball bloomed against the green, a brief, terrible sun that marked the end of her aircraft. Her parachute deployed automatically, the sudden jerk yanking her back into a world of dizzying pain and disorientation. She swung beneath the silk, descending slowly into the smoke-filled valley. The sounds of the firefight were distant now. She had no idea if her last pass had been enough. She was alone, injured, and descending into enemy territory. The mission had changed. It was no longer about saving others. It was about survival. And as the trees rushed up to meet her, she blacked out, the world fading to a silent, painful nothing. The first thing she was aware of was the smell of pine needles and damp earth. The second was the pain, a sharp, insistent throbbing in her leg and a dull ache across her ribs. Ava opened her eyes to a canopy of green, her vision blurry. She was tangled in the straps of her parachute, suspended a few feet above the ground in a thicket of young trees. The memory returned in a sickening rush. The crippled aircraft, the ejection, the violent jerk of the parachute. A voice, low and close, made her freeze. "Easy, Captain. Don't move." She turned her head slowly, wincing at the pain. A face, streaked with dirt and camo paint, looked up at her. It was Nomad. Behind him, several of his men stood in a protective perimeter, their weapons pointed outward. They had found her. "We saw you go down," Nomad said, his voice gruff but gentle as he used a knife to carefully cut the parachute lines. "Your last run? You took out the trucks. Gave us the window we needed." He and another soldier eased her down to the forest floor. "The real cavalry showed up 5 minutes after you hit the dirt. A pair of F-16s cleared the rest of the area. The Jolly Greens came back in and got us." Ava tried to process this. "The team?" "Everyone. Everyone," Nomad confirmed, a hard smile touching his lips. "Thanks to you." He applied a field dressing to the shrapnel wound on her leg. "Now, let's get you home." The flight back on the rescue helicopter was a blur of exhaustion and relief. When they landed at the base, the scene was nothing like what she had expected. The usual controlled chaos of the flight line had been replaced by a strange, solemn silence. As the helicopter's rotors spun down, the door slid open. A crowd had gathered. Not a cheering crowd, but a silent, respectful assembly of pilots, mechanics, and support staff. They stood in two loose lines, creating a path from the helicopter to the base hospital tent. Their faces were not judgmental, but filled with a profound, awed respect. And then she saw him. Colonel Riggs. He stood at the end of the path, his posture rigid, his face an unreadable mask. Ava's heart sank. This was it. The moment of reckoning. She had disobeyed a direct order, destroyed a multi-million-dollar aircraft, and nearly started an international incident. She braced herself for the arrest, for the cold, formal words that would end her career. Nomad and another soldier helped her down from the helicopter, supporting her weight as her injured leg buckled. The silence was deafening, broken only by the whine of the turbine and the crunch of their boots on the asphalt. They began the slow, painful walk toward the colonel. Eva kept her eyes forward, refusing to show weakness. She expected his glare, his cold fury. But as she got closer, she saw that his gaze was not on her face. He was staring past her, toward the empty sky from which she had come. His eyes held a deep, complicated emotion she couldn't name. They stopped a few feet from him. The entire base seemed to be holding its breath. Ava straightened her back as much as she could, preparing to accept her fate. Colonel Riggs's eyes finally met hers. He looked older, the lines on his face deeper than she remembered. He looked at the blood-soaked bandage on her leg, at the bruises already darkening on her face, at the sheer, stubborn will that kept her standing. His gaze was a long, searching appraisal. He did not speak. No words of condemnation, no recitation of regulations. Instead, he took a single sharp step forward. His right hand, which had been clenched at his side, rose. It was not a gesture of anger. It was a salute. Crisp, precise, and held with the intensity that spoke volumes. It was not the salute of a superior officer to a subordinate. It was the salute of one warrior to another, an acknowledgement of sacrifice, of courage, and of a debt that could never be repaid. In that moment, the silence broke. Not with cheers, but with a wave of motion. Every airman, every soldier, every person on that tarmac followed their commander's lead. Hands rose in unison, a forest of respect saluting the ghost who had returned a hero. Eva Rostova, her body broken but her spirit intact, did not return the salute. She simply gave a slow, weary nod of acknowledgement. The mission was over. The men were home. And as two medics finally stepped forward with a stretcher, the weight of it all finally crashed down upon her, and she allowed herself, at last, to be carried away.